And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. On this week's episode, Horace Silver, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called The Stylings of Silver, released in 1957. This one's a great album with all the players on top form. Some of the highlights include My One and Only Love, also a famous rendition of the Silver Quintet on the song Home Cooking, a swinging, enjoyable compilation of songs. Horoscope was released in 1960 and sees the sophisticated yet swinging hard bop themes that Silver was famous for. One reason the Silver Quintet was one of the best hard bop bands from the 60s was because of its dynamic group interplay and soulful grooves, as seen on songs like Nika's Dream and the nostalgic Strollin'. And Blowin the Blues Away, released in 1959, a very joyful compilation of hard bop songs. This one's one of Silver's best albums. The album sees the band in top form, also gives us an array of great original compositions. Two of the tracks went on to become jazz classics: Peace, a warm ballad, and a swinging gospel-based track called Sister Sadie. There's a lot of variety of the songs, from up-tempo pieces like Break City and slower pieces like Melancholy Mood. So that was some insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. On this week's episode, Horace Silver, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Stylings of Silver, released in 1957. This album is unique because of the vast array of sonic landscapes it presents. The album combines hard bop and soul jazz. The album's full of captivating sounds, from catchy melodies to bluesy harmonies to dynamic rhythms. At the time of this recording, Silver was already an influential pianist in the jazz music scene. His innovative piano melodies and compositions propelled him to the front of the jazz movement. This album is based on his style, a style that the world came to know as The Stylings of Silver. Another great play on the album, tenor saxophonist Hank Mobley. He was one of the pioneers of hard bop and soul jazz, and he lays the foundation for Silver's playing. Trumpeter Art Farmer is very graceful and soulful. His music showcases his amazing musical instinct in some unforgettable solos. There's bassist Teddy Kotick, who lays the backbone of the album, and drummer Louis Hayes, whose rhythmic timing and dynamic energy rounded off the ensemble. Some of the top tracks on the album: Soulville, a slow bluesy ballad that's very expressive and soulful. Art Farmer's trumpet solo on this track is mesmerizing. The Backbeat, a very catchy melody featuring a rhythmic tapestry of sound between bass and drums. On Home Cooking, the entire band comes together with some lively swinging music. So overall, a great hard bop and soul jazz album featuring the bluesy sounds and rhythms and dynamic solos that are a hallmark of the genre. Upon release, this album was hailed as a masterpiece and is a classic album today. Horoscope was released in 1960. This album opens up with an irresistible Horace Silver composition called Strollin'. The rest of the album is as exuberant, and on each track his compositional skills, the background instrumentals and arrangements are top class. Blue Michelle and Junior Cook's duets are one highlight, contrasting styles that bring out the flavor of the entire ensemble. Michelle's trumpet playing is very breezy and nostalgic, and Cook's saxophone lines are scorching and dynamic. Silver is also great as an accompanying pianist. He's especially good on Strolling, on an up-tempo track called Yeah, where he blends his music with some great lyrical storytelling, and there's a gospel-type funk track on Me and My Baby. This is a very swinging compilation of songs that takes us back to Silver's days with Art Blakey. Another standout track that sees the entire band coming together, Nika's Dream. Blowin the Blues Away was released in 1959. This was a total masterpiece comprising 7 original compositions by Horace Silver. There's basically a quintet section which performs on many of the tracks, and the rhythm section performs on the remaining 2 tracks, St. Vitus Dance and Melancholy Mood. Each of the songs have a separate mood and individuality to them, and Horace and his bandmates beautifully bring out the essence of each song. This album is also a great introduction to Silver's albums. The title track is one of the highlights, a bright swinging song. There's a solo by Blue Michelle on trumpet and some powerful piano by Silver. Michelle plays very sensitively and nostalgically on slower pieces like Peace and Melancholy Mood. Sister Sadie, another great funky track, it's also a great piece of soul jazz. So it's a very funky jazz-oriented album with some great original compositions by Silver. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. On this week's episode, Horace Silver, his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending festival news. March is around the corner, and Smoke Jazz Club, one of the leading jazz clubs in New York City, is prepping for a dazzling concert starring some leading jazz talents. The festivities will be kickstarted with Grammy Award-winning jazz master Terry Lynn Carrington paying tribute to Max Roach with a performance from March 5th to 9th. Also making a debut appearance at Smoke Jazz Club is pianist Fred Hirsch. He'll be performing from March 12th to 16th. There's also bebop legend Charles McPherson. He'll be performing alongside his quintet from March 19th to 23. The festivities finish with some great trumpet melodies by trumpet legend Jeremy Pelt alongside his orchestra. For more information, please visit smokejazz.com. So that was some trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Horace Silver's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. On this week's episode, Horace Silver, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called the Tokyo Blues, released in 1962. So in 1961, the Silver Quintet toured Japan, and many of these songs are inspired by the songs he heard while on tour. This is a tribute album to his fans at that concert. There's 4 original compositions, also a jazz classic called Cherry's Blossom. The songs are tinged with Latin, blues and hard bop. Serenade to a Soul Sister was released in 1968. This album is characterized by cheeriness and good humor. The album was recorded in 2 different sessions starring 2 different quintets. There's a variety of styles and rhythms on the tracks, from a funky psychedelic sally to the exotic jungle juice to a playful rain dance. And Song for My Father, released in 1965. Another great classic hard bop album. A very innovative, complex album blending complex rhythms and harmonies with a touch of sophistication. Many of the tracks are inspired by Silver's love of the exotic, like the bossa nova Song for My Father or the tropical rhythms of K-Pasa. The title track went on to become one of Silver's best compositions of all time. Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. On this week's episode, Horace Silver, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called the Tokyo Blues, released in 1962. This album was dedicated to Japan. Also, in the opening liner notes, Silver remarks that his fans in Japan loved his renditions of Latin-themed tunes, so he included some of those in the albums as well. These Latin tunes are very beautiful, especially how Silver's band navigates them. The opening track, for instance, a very jaunty track featuring great wind instrumentals. Most of the songs are original compositions by Silver except for one track, Cherry's Blossom. On Silver's tune, a Horace Silver favorite, it's a very structurally simple song with an infectious bass line. Junior Cook and Hank Mobley have some great duets on tenor and soprano saxophone. Silver, as always, is on top notch with his piano playing. The drum rhythms really bring out the flavor of the Latin tunes. Serenade to a Soul Sister was released in 1968. This one's a great collaboration between Silver and leading saxophonist of the time, Stanley Tarantine. There's also Charles Tolliver on trumpet, and together they give us some great soul jazz from the 60s. The album features 6 of Silver's original compositions. The opening track is probably the best, Psychedelic Sally, a catchy, joyful tune. The song starts off with a funky bass line. The horns are very exuberant as they join in. Then comes a bluesy saxophone solo, a powerful trumpet run, and Silver finishes the song with a piano solo. A beautiful rocking classic. The rest of the songs are also amazing, upbeat and joyful tunes. The first 3 tunes feature a quintet performance, Silver, Tarantine and Tolliver with Silver on piano. These are bluesy, upbeat songs. On the final 3 tunes, the lineup changes. It's Benny Maupin on saxophone. The album ends with a beautiful piano trio ballad called Next Time I Fall in Love. So overall, this album is a great compilation of 60s funk and hard bop. And Song for My Father, released in 1964. During the time of this album release, Silver's band had undergone several changes. Many of his players went on to become jazz stars in their own right. Many of the players on this early album release were so, from an up-and-coming Carmel Jones on trumpet to Joe Henderson on tenor saxophone. One of the highlights is the title track featuring some great piano from Horace Silver. Silver starts off with a rocking piano solo, then Henderson joins in on saxophone. His playing is very adventurous. Many of the tracks were originally composed by Silver with the exception of The Kicker, which is played out by dynamic drumming by Roger Humphreys. The lineup changes on the song Calcutta Cutie, where we see Blue Michelle taking the trumpet. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. On this week's episode, Horace Silver, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were discussing during this program. So Horace Silver was one of the leading composers and pianists from the Hall of Fame of Jazz. He was a pioneer of hard bop, also known for his quirky style of piano playing. He was influenced by several genres of music, from Latin to African to gospel music. He started out as a saxophonist, then switched to piano. One of his inspirations was pianist Bud Powell. He was discovered by saxophonist Stan Getz. He then moved to New York, where he started touring alongside Art Blakey. In the early 50s, he performed alongside a trio featuring himself on piano, Blakey on drums, and Percy Hart taking up bass. One of their notable albums recorded together was The Jazz Messengers. In 1956, he formed a new quintet, a hard bop quintet featuring the same players from The Jazz Messengers, with the exception of Art Blakey, who was substituted by Louis Hayes. In 1956, he started touring with Blue Note Records. During his time with Blue Note Records, he became one of the pioneers of the hard bop genre, which combined elements of rhythm and blues and gospel music with jazz. His playing style on the piano was also very innovative and won him nationwide fame with its range of innovative melodic ideas. So that was some insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Stylings of Silver, released in 1957. This one's a great album with all the players on top form. Some of the highlights include My One and Only Love, also a famous rendition of the Silver Quintet on the song Home Cooking, a swinging, enjoyable compilation of songs. Blowin the Blues Away was released in 1959. A very joyful compilation of hard bop songs. This one's one of Silver's best albums. The album sees his band in top form, also gives us an array of great original compositions. 2 of the tracks went on to become jazz classics: Peace, a warm ballad, and a swinging gospel-based track, Sister Sadie. There's a lot of variety on the songs, from the up-tempo pieces like Break City and slower pieces like Melancholy Mood. And Serenade to a Soul Sister, released in 1968. This album is characterized by cheeriness and good humor. The album was recorded in 2 different sessions starring 2 different quintets. There's a variety of styles and rhythms on the tracks, from a funky psychedelic sally to the exotic jungle juice to a playful rain dance. So that was some insight into everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Horace Silver. And on that note, we've come to an end of this week's episode of the program. Don't forget you can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Horace. So on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.